Hello, I'm Jerry Skinner, and welcome. Today I want to talk about the Confederate President Jefferson Phineas Davis. Now, I didn't really know a whole lot about Jefferson Davis. I knew he was the President of the Confederacy. I knew some things about him, but I never did realize what kind of man he actually was. And the more I studied him, the more I liked him. I know that he was a slave owner, but I don't like to judge people by our standards, today's standards, of what took place in the past. And so I try to judge them by what was happening at the time. And what was happening at the time showed that him and his brother Joseph, his older brother, who was much older than Jeff was, pretty good people as far as being a good person, if you can say that, and own a slave. So I'm not making excuses for them, but I will tell you this. Both plantations, Briarwood, which was Jeff Davis's, and Hurricane, which was his brother Joseph's, they wouldn't even call their slaves, they called them servants. Not only that, but they let the slaves, or the servants, form their own government. They dished out their own, made up their own rules, dished out their own punishment. They ruled themselves. Now they had one, I want to tell you about Ben Montgomery. They had one slave by the name of Ben Montgomery, and Ben kept running off. So Joseph asked him, said, "Why do you keep running off? You're liable to get shot and killed, because if people, if they find out you're a runaway slave, they're liable to do anything. Why do you keep doing that?" Ben said, "Well, I want to be my own man. I want to make my own living. I want my family to be free." They said, "All right, I'll tell you what we'll do. I will build you a store. I'll pay for it. You run it. It's a dry goods store. You run it. I will charge you what it costs me for you not to be here working for me. I'll charge you what that is, but any over profit over that is yours." And he said, "I'm going to let you have the use of my library, and we're going to teach you how to read and do math." And they did. So they placed Ben in this store. Well, he did so well, he bought his own freedom. And not just that, he bought the freedom of his wife, where she could stay home, he said, and take care of their kids. Ben Montgomery is a story of its own, and I did one on Mound Bayou, which was an all-black town created by the slaves of Jefferson Davis and his brother. Anyway, it's an amazing story. But now, Jefferson Davis's older brother wanted him to be in the military. Thought that'd be good for him. So he finagled to get him into West Point. Although Jeff didn't want to be in the military, but he wanted to please his brother, so there he goes, and he graduates from West Point. He's assigned to a post. There he meets Sarah Taylor. Now, Sarah Taylor happened to be the daughter of Zachary Taylor, who was the post commander. The same Zachary Taylor that will later on become president. But Zachary didn't want his daughter running off to the South. So what he decided to do was he was going to ship him out, assign him to another post. Thought he'd get rid of him. Well, Jeff didn't like the idea, so he surprised Taylor by resigning his commission. And he married Sarah anyway. And then he takes her off back home to the South. Now get this. They were only married 3 months when they both caught malaria. She died. He didn't. He was so devastated from that. And of course, her daddy hated him. But he was so devastated from that. For the next 8 years, he worked with a slave by the name, as I said, Ben Montgomery, that his brother Joseph had let him borrow. They cleared land for 8 years to make Jeff a plantation. And they did. After 8 years, Jeff goes over to see his brother one day, and he meets Verena Howe, who was a friend of his brother's wife. They fall in love, and they marry. Now, he decides he's going to run for Congress. He fails. Then later on, he tries it again, and this time he wins. So he becomes a representative from Mississippi. Then he decides he wants to be senator and becomes senator from Mississippi. About that time, the Mexican War began. The American-Mexican War. He resigns his position as senator, takes up his old commission, goes to war. Guess who his commander is? His ex-father-in-law, Zachary Taylor. But he's General Zachary Taylor now. Things changed because Jeff Davis becomes a military hero while fighting the American-Mexican War. A genuine hero. This changes Taylor's mind about him. And actually, he writes him a letter and he says, Jeff, my daughter was a much better judge of a man's character than I was. I apologize. After that, when President Taylor's term was over, President Pierce come in, and Pierce recommended and appointed Jefferson Davis as the Secretary of War. Now, you know that today that's like saying, I'm going to make you the Secretary of Defense. Well, as Secretary of War, he builds up the military, tries to make them as strong as possible. And this is the same military that a few years later, he's going to go to war with. Now, he did his best to keep Mississippi from seceding from the Union. He made a speech in Congress and Senate. He made a speech in the House in Mississippi. Don't secede. He was against secession. He said the saddest day of his life was when Mississippi left the Union. He made a sad speech, and he almost cried during the speech at the Senate. He didn't want to leave, but he did. Now, why did he do that? Why would a man who had been the Secretary of War, senator, fought for the Union, why would he do that? For the same reason that Robert E. Lee did. You see, if you think back, when this nation first started, there was 13 colonies, or states, if you wish. They didn't want to join a union, a confederate gathering of different colonies. They were independent. Of course, they had to, and they did later on, because for protection from other countries. One of them couldn't fight off a major country, and they thought they could together, which they ended up doing. But their loyalty was still to those states, and their loyalty to those states became the greatest thing. It became, they were actually more loyal to the state than they was to the government. So they felt, Davis and others like Lee, felt that they would be dishonored if they didn't fight for their state. Now, we say that they were dishonored for fighting for their state and leaving the Union. Now, that's the way they seen it. They seen that they would be dishonored if they didn't fight for their state. So he goes back home to Mississippi. Lee goes to Virginia. And he's elected president of the Confederacy. During this time, him and his wife will have six kids. 4 of them die at a young age. 1 gets diphtheria and dies. 1 falls actually from the Confederate. When they moved the Confederacy from Montgomery to Virginia, to Richmond, the Confederate Capitol had high stairs in it, 2nd floor. This little boy, 10 years old, falls off and he's killed. He's killed because he lands on hard brick. Another dies at a young age. And the last one is a 21-year-old who was in Memphis after the war and catches yellow fever when they had the yellow fever epidemic in Memphis, and he dies. So they went through some stuff, I'm telling you. To lose a kid is the worst thing in the world that can happen to you. So all this time, they were going through all of this. Now, when the war was over and he had lost, of course they wanted to hang him. They put him in prison for a couple of years, but all this time, they was wanting to execute him. So what they did was they told Henry Wirz, who was the commander of Andersonville, the Confederate prison that was holding Yankee troops. They told him, now we're fixing to execute you, and I think he was the only one that they did. We're fixing to execute you because, mainly it was because President Lincoln had been assassinated and the nation was out for blood. So they told him, the day before they executed him, they told him, they said, Captain Wirz, if you will say that Jefferson Davis ordered you to not feed and to persecute Union prisoners at Andersonville will free you. Wirz was the most honorable man probably in the Civil War. He said, but that would be a lie. They executed him the next day. 2 years later, they let Jefferson Davis out. He had no money, he had nothing. He was on the mercy of ex-Confederates, really. He went to Biloxi, Mississippi, because a lady down there had a home on the Gulf, and he wanted to write his memoirs. And the lady and her husband were staunch Confederates. As a matter of fact, once she passed on, she left the house and the land to Jefferson Davis. Now, the main thing is this. Jefferson Davis was a Confederate that owned slaves. But I don't know if you can be gracious while doing that. I don't know. But anyway, if you can, him and his brother Joseph was. So let's watch the video we did on Jefferson Davis. This is Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederate States of America. The life of Jefferson Phineas Davis is one of sadness and regret. He had not only lost the hope of a new nation, but during his lifetime, he buried 4 of his 6 children. Jeff Davis was born in Kentucky on June the 3rd, 1808. His family moved to Woodville, Mississippi when Jeff was 2. Now this is Rosemont Plantation where Jeff was raised, as the youngest of 10 children born to Samuel and Georgia Davis. When Jeff was 16, Samuel, his dad, died, and Jeff's much older brother Joseph sort of took their dad's place. Joseph had already become quite prominent and owned an 1,800-acre plantation just south of Vicksburg that he called Hurricane. Now Joseph wanted Jeff to have a military career and used his influence to get him appointed to the West Point Military Academy, although Jeff wasn't interested in the military. He could not disappoint his older brother. 4 years later, in 1828, Jefferson Davis graduated from West Point. He was assigned to Fort Crawford, Wisconsin. While he was assigned to Fort Crawford, he met and fell in love with Sarah Knox Taylor. She was the daughter of the fort commander, Colonel Zachary Taylor. Yes, the same Zachary Taylor that years later would become President of the United States. Colonel Taylor did not approve of the romance. He didn't want his daughter to be married to a military man. To try to separate the two, he had Davis transferred. However, Davis refused to leave and resigned his military commission instead. In 1835, Jefferson Davis and Sarah Knox Taylor were married against the wishes of her family. After their marriage, Jeff convinced Sarah that it would be okay for them to travel south, although summertime in the South was the malarial fever season. He was wrong. Shortly after they arrived, they both became deathly ill with the fever. And on September the 15th, 1835, Sarah died. Jeff and Sarah had only been married for 3 months. She was 21 years old. Colonel Taylor blamed Davis for her death. After Sarah's death, Jeff became withdrawn and spent the next 8 years or so clearing land that his brother Joseph had gave him. He called it Briarfield, and it was connected to Joseph's hurricane plantation. Now during this time, Davis, with the help of his only slave, Ben Montgomery, built Briarfield into a prosperous plantation. Over the objections of other plantation owners, Joseph and Jeff placed Ben Montgomery overseer over both plantations, Hurricane and Briarfield, a position that was usually held for white men only. After the Civil War, Briarfield was actually sold to Ben Montgomery, the Davis's ex-slave, at which was said to be at a very reasonable price. Now 8 years after Sarah's death, in 1843, Davis ran for a seat in the Mississippi House of Representatives. He lost. This was his first taste of politics. That year at Christmas time, Jeff was visiting his brother Joseph when he met Verena Banks Howell, the daughter of a family friend. Although she was only 17 and he was 35, permission was given by her family to marry. Verena was the granddaughter of New Jersey Governor Richard Howell, but her mother's family were from Mississippi. Jefferson Davis and Verena Howell were married February the 26th, 1845. That same time in 1845, Jefferson Davis's mother, Georgia, passes away. After his mother's death, Jeff ran for and was elected to Mississippi Representative at Large to the U.S. Congress. The next year in 1846, Jeff gave up his seat in Congress to enlist in the Mexican War. He was given a command under his former father-in-law, now General Zachary Taylor. During the war, Davis's regiment distinguished itself, making Davis a hero. He was also wounded during a battle, the Battle of Buena Vista. After the battle, General Taylor wrote Davis saying, "My daughter, sir, was a better judge of character than I was." 1 year later, in 1847, after resigning from the military, Davis was appointed to the U.S. Senate by Mississippi Governor Brown. And in 1849, Zachary Taylor was elected President of the United States and remained president until 50 when his death occurred. In 1852, the first of 6 children were born to Jeff and Verena. Samuel Emory Davis was born July the 30th, 1852. That same year, President Pierce appointed Jefferson Davis Secretary of War. He remained Secretary of War until 1856, when President Pierce went out of office. As Secretary of War, Davis built up the military, the same military that he would later fight as President of the Confederacy. He confided in his wife that the South could never win against a much stronger North, but maybe the South could make it so costly for the North that they would eventually let the South secede. While Davis was still Secretary of War in June of 1854, their son Emory, less than 2 years old, died of an undiagnosed disease. The next year, on February the 25th, 1855, their second child, Margaret Howe Davis was born. She'd be the only Davis child to marry and have children. The next year, in 1856, Jeff Davis left Secretary of War and went back to the Senate. In 1857, January the 16th, the Davises' third child was born, Jefferson Davis Jr. In 1858, Davis argued in the Senate against secession. The next year, their fourth child, Joseph Evans, was born on April 18, 1859. In January of 1861, Mississippi secedes from the Union. Davis makes a speech at the Senate, stating that it was the saddest day of his life. He had fought secession, but he felt honor-bound to support Mississippi. After resigning from the Senate, the Davis family returned to Briarfield. A month later, in February of 1861, Jefferson Davis was elected temporary president of the Confederacy at the state capitol in Montgomery, and elected permanent president of a 6-year term in November of that year. The year 1861 was a busy time for the Davises. Jeff had been elected president, and the Confederate capital in Montgomery was moved from Alabama to Richmond, Virginia. Verena was 35 years old when she became the First Lady of the Confederacy. Jeff Davis was 52. She was also pregnant with her fifth child, William Howe Davis, born 6 December 1861. As President of the Confederacy, Davis's first act sent a peace delegation to Washington, hoping to prevent war, and President Lincoln, trying to hold the Union together, refused to receive the delegation. A few months later, at Fort Sumner, war began. On April the 30th, 1864, tragedy struck the Confederate mansion in Richmond, when the Davises' fourth child, 5-year-old Joseph Evans Davis, while climbing over a banister at the executive mansion and falling on the brick floor below, and dying in a few minutes later in his mother's arms. 2 months after Joseph's death, the Davises' sixth child, Winnie, was born on June the 27th. During this time, Mrs. Davis had the occasion to witness a young black boy by the name of Jim Limber being beaten up by a grown black man. The Davises took Jim and unofficially adopted him, even giving him their name. Jim was with the Davises when they were captured after the war. Jim was taken from the Davises crying by Union soldiers. They never saw Jim again. In March of 1865, the war was going bad for the South. Jefferson Davis asked Verena to take the children and leave Richmond for their protection. She heads to Charlotte, North Carolina, and rents a house and waits for word from her husband. By April the 10th, Davis learns of Lee's surrender. Davis heads south, leaving Richmond to the advancing Union Army. He was hoping to meet up with General Joseph E. Johnston. When he did, Johnston recommended that Davis give up. Davis keeps heading south, and 2 days later learns that General Johnston had also surrendered. His only hope then was to make it to General Kirby Smith in Texas and continue the struggle from there. On May the 8th, Davis reunited with Verena and the children. And 2 days later, on May the 10th, the Davises' party was captured by Union soldiers. He was quickly charged with treason and taken back to Virginia and imprisoned at Fortress Monroe. For the next 2 years, Verena wrote everyone she could, asking for help for her husband. She was held under guard herself at a Savannah hotel. She sent her children to Canada with their grandmother so that they'd be protected from death threats. Abraham Lincoln had just been assassinated 1 month earlier on the 14th of April, and the Union was calling for the head of Jefferson Davis. Davis spent 2 years in prison, waiting trial. He actually believed that he could show the court that under the Constitution, states had the right to secede. Now this created a dilemma for the government. The government began to look for other charges, such as war crimes, even on one occasion offering Confederate colonels Wirt life the night before his scheduled hanging if he would state that President Davis ordered mistreatment of prisoners at Andersonville. Wirt refused, stating it would be a lie. He was hanged the next morning. After 2 years in prison in 1867, Jefferson Davis was released under a $100,000 bond that was put up by wealthy friends in the North. Davis was in poor health from his prison stay and virtually broke. For the next few years, he would depend on family and friends for support. After much traveling, visiting ex-Confederates at home and abroad, he eventually settled on a job as president of an insurance company in Memphis, Tennessee. While living on Court Street in Memphis, tragedy struck again. On the 16th of October, 1872, the Davises' fifth child, William Howell Davis, died of diphtheria. He was 10 years old. Sometime around 1875, a very wealthy widow by the name of Sarah Ann Ellis Dorsey learned of Jefferson Davis's plight. She had been the childhood friend of Mrs. Davis, and her late husband were staunch supporters of the Confederacy. She offered Davis the use of a cottage at Bolivar, one of her homes located on the Gulf Coast in Biloxi. You can see that the construction is still going on from the damage here from Hurricane Katrina. Now the peaceful atmosphere and beautiful view of the Gulf the perfect place for Davis to write the rise and fall of the Confederate government. In 1876, daughter Margaret marries Joel Hayes in Memphis. She will raise the only grandchildren the Davises will have. 2 years after Margaret's marriage to Joel Hayes, her brother Jeffrey Davis Jr., the third child of Jeff and Verena, working in a bank for his brother-in-law in Memphis, was suddenly stricken with yellow fever during the Memphis yellow fever epidemic. Jeff Jr. dies October the 16th, 1878. He was 21 years old. After Jefferson Davis Jr.'s death that same year, the widow Sarah Ellis Dorsey dies. In her will, she had bequeathed Bolivar to Davis. By this time, the Davises had only 2 living children, Margaret, who was still living in Memphis and would bring the grandchildren to Biloxi to visit their grandparents, and Winnie, who lived with her parents at Bolivar. It is said that Jefferson Davis never turned away a Confederate veteran. He felt that their sacrifice was more for him than it was for the Confederacy. During these years, Davis and his daughter Winnie would attend Confederate reunions across the country. And Winnie was considered a daughter of the Confederacy and much beloved in the South. And in 1887, while staying with a family friend up north, she formed a relationship with a New York attorney by the name of Fred Wilkinson. In 1889, she announced their engagement. No one expected such an outcry from ex-Confederates and Southerners over Winnie wanting to marry a Yankee. It was decided that Jeff Davis himself was the only one that could calm the outcry. Davis supported the marriage, but before he could speak to the public, he became very sick while visiting friends in New Orleans with acute bronchitis. Jefferson Davis died around 1 a.m. on the 6th December 1889. His funeral was one of the largest ever held in New Orleans. His final resting place is the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia. Jefferson Davis, Confederate president, was 81 years old. The next year in 1890, Winnie's engagement to Fred Wilkinson ended under much public pressure. She never married, and neither did he. In 1891, Winnie and Verena moved to New York City in order to make money to live on. Verena wrote newspaper articles for a New York newspaper, and Winnie wrote magazines and books and continued her close relationship with Confederate organizations. In 1898, Winnie was attending a Confederate reunion in Atlanta, Georgia, when she was drenched in a sudden rainstorm. Unable to change her wet clothes for several hours on a long train trip to meet her mother back in Rhode Island, by the time she arrived at the Rockingham Hotel, she was running a severe fever. Although the hotel was closing for the season, they allowed Winnie and her mother to stay. She was too sick to be moved. On September the 18th, 1898, Winnie Davis, daughter of the Confederacy, died from malarial gastritis. Thousands attended her funeral, and she was buried in the family plot at the Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. Winnie Davis was 34 years old. 4 years after Winnie's death, her mother sold Bolivar to a Mississippi Confederate organization with the stipulation that it would be used as a Confederate veterans home for ex-Confederates. Also, after the last Confederate died, it was to be turned into a monument for the Confederate President Jefferson Davis. Now this is the back side of the Davis home, and not far from the back is the Confederate Cemetery, and in the Confederate Cemetery is also the tomb of the unknown Confederate soldier. In the 1940s, Jefferson Davis's dad, Samuel Davis, was moved from the Hurricane Plantation where he was buried to the Confederate Cemetery at Bolivar. 4 years later, on the 16th of October 1906, Verena, First Lady of the Confederacy, passed away from pneumonia. Her only living child, Margaret, was by her side. Verena was honored with a military escort, and she's buried next to her husband and family at Richmond. Verena was 80 years old. 3 years later, after her mother's death, Margaret passed away. 18 July 1909. A few years earlier, Margaret and her family had moved from Memphis to Colorado Springs, Colorado. But Margaret was also buried in the Davis plot in Richmond. Margaret Davis was 54 years old. Her descendants are still living in Colorado Springs. In 1978, on the 17th of October, President Jimmy Carter, a Southern president from Georgia, posthumously restored U.S. citizenship to Jefferson Davis.